People's Platform. Bring back our stolen money. That's been the clarion call of millions of Sri Lankans for several years now, ever since the Aragalaya. Good evening. Welcome to the People's Platform. I'm Niresh Eliothambi. We have with us as our guests tonight Attorney at Law Nethmi Jinadasa, Advocacy and Research Officer of Transparency International Sri Lanka, and Attorney at Law Sankhitha Gunaratne, Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verité Research. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Now, let me start with Sankhitha. We have heard of this Proceeds of Crime Bill, which we hope will shortly be put to Parliament, and that is something that the government has been saying is required in order to bring back stolen money, whether it was money stolen in the past or money that is possibly being stolen right now or in the future. The problem is that when money is spirited away to a foreign country, it's very difficult, legally speaking, to get it back. Now, the Proceeds of Crime Bill is expected to sort this matter out. Sankhitha, could you tell us a little bit about why we need this? What's wrong with our current legal framework?
Right. Thank you, Niresh. So, as you very clearly pointed out at the start, there was this clarion call for the recovery of stolen assets. And then making the switch to a Proceeds of Crime Act, our viewers might wonder, is this the same thing? Are these two different things? So through the Proceeds of Crime Act, what the government has pledged to do is to address that very problem, but it deals not only with stolen assets held abroad, it also deals with the proceeds of any crime. So whether it's murder, theft, corruption, fraud, whatever it is, if there has been the proceeds of it, whether it's tangible or intangible, whether it's a house or a car, right, or a yacht parked somewhere abroad in foreign waters, it would cover all of that. Why we needed a law is, one, as you very clearly said, because there was such a public demand for it, and this has been in the works for several years. Since at least 2017 there was an original framework, and now I think with the negotiations with the IMF also, this came up as something of priority because we needed to meet the demand of the people. And so the lapse in the existing law was that we didn't have a formal consolidated framework that gave the necessary and timely tools for law enforcement officials to keep up with the corruption, because the corruption is progressing at leaps and bounds, and law enforcement with its limited toolkit tends to always be 10 steps behind. So the hope of recovering is always only of a fraction of what is actually stolen. So giving law enforcement that necessary powers, and then introducing the relevant bodies to the system, giving redress to the victims of the corruption or relevant crime was the need of the hour. So it appears that that is the demand that is attempted to be met through this. However, I must caution all of us here, we know very well that Sri Lanka is well known, famous for having laws on paper. So just because we bring the law doesn't mean we will implement it, but we will enforce it. So there's a lot yet to be seen and a lot to be done in translating whatever is introduced through this law, if it is introduced, into action.
Very interesting indeed, and we will get to that implementation or non-implementation part shortly, but could you elaborate a bit on international best practices? What have other countries done? We are not the only country to suffer from corruption. It's everywhere, and the unfortunate thing is we don't do a lot about it, or we haven't, but many countries actually have.
Yes, so I'll talk about a couple of recent examples of asset recovery. One, and a very well-known one, is about Nigeria's former president Sani Abacha. He had stolen billions of US dollars, and it was held in Swiss accounts elsewhere, and through a negotiation process, while Nigeria, mind you, didn't have an asset recovery law in place, through memoranda of understanding between the World Bank, the Swiss authorities and Nigeria, they managed to recover billions of dollars back to Nigeria. But having said that, that was still a fraction of what is said to have been stolen from Nigeria. But still, this is why there was so much call for asset recovery, because if you compare that to the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is facing, people felt that recovering stolen assets could actually serve as a solution to the economic crisis. However, it must be cautioned that asset recovery takes time. So it by no means can be an immediate solution. Another interesting example, and I've talked about this often, is about the Vice President of Equatorial Guinea, former Vice President Theodorin Obiang. Now, he was known for being this, charismatic person who enjoyed collecting, exotic things like Michael Jackson's glove from the bad tour. The bad tour of Michael Jackson.
Oh, that's where it ended up.
That is where it ended up, the crystal-studded glove that he wore. So this was the subject of an asset recovery action that failed in the end. But he even had assets in France, because it's a former French colony, like castles and palaces. So French organizations, two French organizations, that is TI France and Sherpa, actually filed actions in the French courts, that's a destination country, to recover the assets back to Equatorial Guinea. So this kind of example, and then there's a recent example of the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia involving the former president of Malaysia, and he and his cronies actually are alleged to have siphoned away finances that were set apart to develop the economy of Malaysia, amounting to something like 5 billion US dollars, which has now been a larger amount that was pilfered away, but 4.83 billion that is being brought back to Malaysia. So these are recent examples. So in terms of your question of best practices, generally there needs to be good coordination between the origin country of the assets and the destination country. You should have transparency in the process, where you make sure that these deals are not done behind closed doors. You need to allow civil society access. You need to allow the voices of victims in the process, and then also ensure that the stolen assets or the proceeds of crime actually end up with the origin persons that they were stolen from, because part of the international conversation is whether stolen assets, once recovered, can be re-corrupted. Because often the problem we're dealing with, even in Sri Lanka, and the allegation that is made, is that we're dealing with corrupt government officials, potentially corrupt politicians. So then if you're bringing back assets into the same government structure or same system, then is there a risk of that being re-corrupted? And that is also a problem that is sought to be solved through this proposed legislation.
Excellent. Nethmi, could you walk us through where we are in this process now? The new Proceeds of Crime Bill, it has not yet been gazetted, but it's been worked on by a special committee for I think about 2 years now. Could you walk us through the process, how it started and where it is right now?
Yes, sure, Niresh. So I will go back to where the need for this law came from. Like you very correctly said in the beginning of the program, going back to the 2022 Aradalaya movement, it was a major slogan, it was a major public demand, which said bring our stolen money back, bring our stolen wealth back. So the public need came from there actually, and then fast forwarding to last year, there was actually end of 2022, where the IMF came into the picture, and the Sri Lankan government came into an agreement with the IMF, where one of the main structural benchmarks was to enact a proceeds of crime law, and the deadline was given actually last April 2024 was the deadline given to enact this proceeds of crime law. However, it has been extended until November 2024 based on the recent review that was done by the IMF. But how it got there was, like you said, a committee was appointed by the Ministry of Justice in late 2022, comprising of 17 members, which included president councils and experts on asset recovery, the police, public officials, such experts who know about these asset recovery laws and the need for it. So the committee was engaged in this task for over a year, and in April 2024, just a few months ago, they published the report of the committee with the draft policy framework for the Proceeds of Crime Bill, which was a comprehensive law. So that particular law, that report, we have reviewed as TISL and Verité Research. We have reviewed the entire framework, and we have picked up on what are the salient features of it, how important this is, and it's actually commendable, the effort put into this report and to bring this new law into place. And currently it is at the legal draftsman department to be gazetted. I believe the Ministry of Justice and the committee, they are in the stage where they are incorporating certain amendments and suggestions that us civil society organizations, especially including TISL and Verité Research, have raised with them. So yes, it is right now at the legal draftsman stage.
If I remember correctly, this committee was chaired by Justice Sankhitha Gunaratne.
That's correct.
And there were 6 learned President's Council among them. So it's obviously they've done a fabulous job. I think it's a 182-page report.
That's correct.
I myself.
A notable absence, though, is civil society, is local civil society in the drafting committee.
Oh, I see. So that is a glaring omission, and we hope that that can be rectified in some way. So it's very heavy on the legal side, but civil society has not been included. Right. So how soon can we expect this to go forward, keeping in mind that we now have elections? What would happen now? We have the Minister of Justice has resigned, but let us presume that the committee report will go forward under a new minister, and then of course we have the elections in the backdrop. But does it matter if the parliament is dissolved, perhaps?
I believe so. Like I said, there's a deadline to meet to enact this legislation, which is November of this year.
So it's a priority.
It is a priority. So like I said earlier, also it is not only a structural benchmark in the agreement with the IMF, it is also one of the 16 priority recommendations.
Right.
So I believe it's crucial and timely that we somehow bring effect to this law.
Right. So I presume, of course, that the President would have full knowledge of the fact that this is a priority, and this needs to get done. And if it goes past November, that would cause issues.
Because in fact, as part of the review that was recently done, as Nethmi very correctly said, March was the original deadline. So why they chose to postpone it to November was that government informed the IMF that they wanted to have consultation about it. So we'll talk about that further going.
Consultation with whoever, civil society.
We'd like to presume that it's the public. Yes.
Okay. Can we get some of the key provisions and principles? Perhaps Nethmi, you can start off on that, and Sankhitha can also come in on that.
Yes. Sure. So like I said, this is a very comprehensive law, and it brings about very new, very novel concepts and very novel provisions, and it creates new authorities. It gives new duties, powers and authorities to these institutions, and also certain officials. So I will just briefly mention a few of them. So one being this Proceeds of Crime law, when enacted, the responsibility of enactment of this law will be vested within the Sri Lanka Police and the Bribery Commission. So within the Sri Lanka Police, there will be a new division established called the Proceeds of Crime Investigation Division, the PCID. So each of these, both these institutions will have investigation officers and designated officers who will be vested with a lot of powers, a lot of responsibilities to carry out very specific tasks and to give effect, basically give effect to this entire legal framework. So and also one noteworthy feature of this law is that it provides for two types of forfeiture of assets. So that is actually in the process where it starts with an investigation, asset tracing, investigation, and then comes seizing, restraining, preserving, and then judicial freezing. The last step would be forfeiture of the proceeds of crime or the asset. So the law provides for two types of forfeiture. The first one being post-conviction based forfeiture, where it is following the conviction of a person who had committed an unlawful activity. So unlawful activity which had yielded proceeds of crime. So that is one type of forfeiture. The second one is non-conviction based forfeiture, which is also known as civil forfeiture, where a property suspected to be a proceeds of crime, and it has been investigated into and established that this property is in fact a proceed of crime, civil proceedings could be instituted against such property for its forfeiture. So that is actually, this concept was firstly introduced in the Anti-Corruption Act, which came into effect last year. So there are provisions for that as well, and this law actually gives more meaning, more depth to this concept under this law. So, and also another key feature of this law is that the burden of proof is reversed. So usually in criminal cases, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution, but here under this law, the burden of proof lies with the person claiming the property is not a proceed of crime. So he has to prove that such property was derived from his lawful incomes and lawful means. So that is a very salient feature in this law. And also I mentioned that this creates several authorities, one being the Proceeds of Crime Management Authority, which is mandated to protect, preserve, manage and dispose the recovered assets. So so establishing this authority is actually a very good, an excellent feature. However, we need to make sure that this authority stays independent and impartial. For example, so this is a new authority, like I said, so it was given a vast power to, like I said, preserve, protect, manage and dispose of assets. So it is imperative that this authority remains independent and remains impartial throughout the whole process. And also another key feature is that this law provides for a trust fund, Victims of Crime Reparation Trust Fund, where a certain amount of a certain portion of the recovered asset or the value would go into this trust fund, and this is actually part of the consolidated fund as well. So these are several key features. I believe if Sankhitha would like to
Sankhitha, any other features that come to mind?
I think one thing is I would expound upon this non-conviction based asset forfeiture by giving an example. So it is where you don't have to connect restrict a property to the wrongdoer. So if I have a car and you can show that my car is the proceeds of crime, you don't have to first prove that I was the criminal who stole that car. You can keep me aside and have a case that says Sri Lanka versus CAD 7869, right?
Oh, I see.
So you proceed directly against the property, and you only need to prove on a balance of probability as opposed to a criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt. On a balance of probability, the state would have to prove that this is the proceeds of crime, and then it can be confiscated after a judicial process. So that's just an example to expound on what
right, but of course all property is registered with somebody, usually, whether it's a car or a villa, or whether it's a bank account or whatever. There is a paper trail, so it would be very easy to find the perpetrator. And of course, my experience in this is that over many years in journalism, people who steal such massive amounts usually like to flaunt their wealth as well. So it's not so difficult to trace worldwide.
And we found examples, if you don't mind me saying, where the FBI, for example, would monitor the social media accounts of persons to see exactly this kind of flaunting, and then trace back up as a tracing, as Nethmi referred to. One final point I would add about the salient features of this law is about the duty to report. So there are certain categories of persons identified in this framework that need to report if they are aware of the existence of the proceeds of crime. So secretaries to ministries, for example, are mandated. Certain high public officials, the financial intelligence unit. So not to do that would be an offense. So the law can be pretty strong if enforced just as strongly.
Well, let's get to that enforcement bit, which it's a bit a small aspect which doesn't seem to happen much in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, we have many laws. Of course, there's always room for more laws where there are gaps, but many of the laws that we have are not enforced. You can start with our traffic laws, but you go on to the much more serious corruption-based laws, and then political activities and transparency and so on. How does one ensure that these laws get applied? Obviously, these authorities and commissions and so on need to be more independent, but how do we get this done? Nethmi, your thoughts on this first?
Sure. Firstly, I think there needs to be proper coordination between authorities, between the government and the authorities.
Right,
also,
that's another issue which comes up.
Yes.
We have this passing the buck
Yes.
scenario, which seems to happen way too often.
Yes. So, and especially like I explained earlier, also this law provides for two institutions. The power is vested with two institutions, which is the Bribery Commission and the police, the Proceeds of Crime Investigation Division of the police. So there needs to be really good, effective coordination between the two authorities to make sure that this law gets implemented properly, it gets enforced properly, and to give meaningful impact to basically to give it to the law, and to make sure that the objectives of this law is met with.
Right. So Sankhitha, we see this problem coming up where there are several institutions which are charged with a particular duty, and we saw this in so many instances, but what comes to mind is the Express Pearl disaster, a massive environmental disaster, and we should have got billions of dollars in compensation. Instead, what did happen was that various institutions started blaming each other for not providing reports, for not cooperating. This this is a perennial problem, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Fully agree with what Nethmi is talking about the need for coordination. And if you zoom out even from that, you wonder whether it's omission or commission. Right? Whether the lack of coordination is due to omission, perhaps the lack of resources, lack of clear mandates, things like that, but also whether it is an act of commission, whether it's actually the question of capture of disempowering state entities who should be taking action. So right now, I would say there are two issues. Two points. One is that we have an opportunity to build upon the energy that we saw on the streets, the demands of the people, coupled with the attention that we are getting and the requirement for us to get our governance in order, because the IMF is in the house, whether we like it or not, and is able to a certain extent, have some control over what the state does. And also we have elections coming up, so we have politicians having to endear themselves to their electorate. So here I think it's really important that the vote base also understands that we have a confluence of events that doesn't often come upon us. So we need to use this power effectively in this moment to ensure that we capitalize on it. The other thing from the point of view of the authorities is that they need to engage in some serious trust building with the people, because just as people have lost and I don't have to mince my words in saying that people have lost faith in politicians, they've also lost faith in the system, hence the call for a system change, right? So if in that kind of context you have, say, the Bribery Commission, the CID, the police, whoever, under these brand new, shiny, powerful laws, they want to take action, they need to show that they are willing to be independent, that they're willing to take action in this moment. If they want to win trust, we don't have time to build trust. We don't have time to wait for a new government. We don't have time to wait for conducive conditions. We need to take action now before we lose the opportunity that have been provided by the new laws as well. So going to the question of enforcement.
Interesting thoughts indeed. We are in conversation with Sankhitha Gunaratne of Verité Research and Nethmi Jinadasa of TISL. We will cross over for a short commercial break and we'll be right back. Don't go away.
People's Platform. 10 teams, 23 matches. ICC Women's T20 World Cup Bangladesh 2024 coming soon.
On the beautiful coastal side, a place of worship for hundreds of people from across the island, seeking love, peace, comfort and healing. The annual festival of St. Anne's Church in Thalavila. Led by Bishop of Chilau, Right Reverend Vimal Siri Jayasuriya, on the 4th of August, 7 a.m. onwards, live on Sirasa TV.
Step away from the conventional art of storytelling. Get ready for the Newsfirst Breakfast Rundown with me, Zulfikar.
Companies play better politics than the politicians of today.
We are not supposed to play with the people's expectation. Then it will be a huge disaster.
When you're bankrupt and when you're going to bankruptcy, two different.
The grandfather is saying it is going to take this long. What does he know?
It's about the lack of sense of humor in Sri Lanka.
Issues that matter the most. Unfiltered discussions. Real Answers. Face to Face. Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on TV1.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. We are discussing the proposed Proceeds of Crime Bill with Sankhitha Gunaratne of Verité Research and Nethmi Jinadasa of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Nethmi, now we discussed earlier that there hasn't been any discourse with the civic organizations and this committee which drafted this, but now that your organization and of course Sankhitha's has seen this 182-page report and gone through it with your usual thoroughness, what strikes you all as needing improvement in this?
Sure.
And I'm sure the members of the committee will be watching this as well. So,
yes, I will touch upon several concerns that we had after we reviewed the entire framework. So, one key feature that we thought was a little bit concerning was that there is no prevalence given to the right to information law. So we actually found it concerning, and we actually raised it with both the Ministry of Justice and the committee, to which they responded positively. They welcomed this concern and they welcomed our feedback on this particular point as well. So to make sure that the fundamental rights of the people are not compromised, we suggested that this law would be implemented subject to the right to information law. And also another concern that we raised was again about the coordination between the authorities and also the independence and impartiality of the authorities which are created by this law. For example, the PCMA, the Proceeds of Crime Management Authority, and also the trust fund I mentioned, the Victims of Crime Reparation Trust Fund. So just to give you a little bit of context, so there is a board established to basically carry out the functions of the PCMA, the Proceeds of Crime Management Authority. I'm sorry. So this board comprises of several members, and appointment of 5 members is to be done by the Ministry of Justice. So the Minister of Justice has the sole discretion to appoint these particular 5 members. So that sort of raises the concern whether this would compromise the independence and impartiality of the board. And so we suggested that it could be sort of change to say maybe the Constitutional Council could make these appointments. So things like that we have suggested. So like I said earlier, also they are still being deliberated, so hopefully these things will be considered in the time to come. And also again the VCRTF, the Victims of Crime Reparation Trust Fund, that also is basically overseen by a board of trustees, and there are 2 members of reputed non-political social service organizations in this board. So these 2 members are also appointed by the Minister of Finance in consultation with the Minister of Justice and Minister of Social Services. Again, the discretion of appointment of 2 members of a social service organization is vested upon the minister. So again, the question comes back whether this would be independent, whether this would be impartial. So those 2 are just 2 examples to show that there were several concerns about the independence and impartiality of authorities. And one other thing I would mention was the competency and the resources of the Bribery Commission and the police, the PCID, to give effect to their mandate to carry out their exercise their duties and powers and tasks given to them by this law. So, for example, I mean, there's a common allegation that the Bribery Commission, they do not exercise their powers to the optimum level, and a justification they bring out is that they are under-resourced. So there are practical issues like this as well. So if that's the case, and by giving powers to the Bribery Commission again under this law and also the police, the question arises whether they will be adequately resourced, especially human resources aspect, whether they are adequately resourced to carry out these functions, because the investigation officers and designated officers I mentioned earlier will be officers who are already in these two authorities. They are already officers. They have already carried out their duties in these two authorities. So this will be a secondary designation they will hold. So they will have to exercise these powers as well. So there needs to be sort of adequate resourcing and adequate funding for these two authorities to function effectively and properly. So that is also one of the concerns that we raised. And again, just one thing to add to the point where Sankhitha mentioned earlier about there was a resistance to give to consult the public and the civil society in this drafting process. So like I said earlier, also the IMF and Sankhitha mentioned that this as well. So the IMF review, which was done recently, they extended the deadline to enact this Proceeds of Crime law until November, to give public consultation and civil society consultation some space. So that was the reason that was mentioned in the review report. So but there was very minimal, actually there was an absence of public and civil society consultation during this drafting process. However, once the report was published, once the report was concluded and it was published in the Ministry of Justice website, and it was available to the public, that is how we also got heard of it and we reviewed it. So after that, we as TISL, we made multiple requests to the Ministry of Justice and the committee. We RTI to get the draft framework. Actually, this was prior to the report being published. So there were many efforts before the report was published and accessible to the public. There were many efforts to get the draft into our hands to review this. So, but it all failed. And after the report was published, we got into our hands and we reviewed it. And again, after multiple efforts and actually with the intervention of the UNDP, we were given a meeting with the Ministry of Justice. And TISL and Verité Research along with UNDP were part of this meeting, where we all raised our concerns regarding this report, the draft framework. And also following that, we got another meeting with the committee who drafted this report, the framework. And there also, it was actually just TISL and Verité Research who were part of this meeting. So I mean, we are grateful that we were given this opportunity. It was a hard-earned opportunity. We pushed for it and we got it, and we are really glad about it. But it would have been more sort of impactful if the public and the civil society were brought into this picture, this whole drafting process beforehand, earlier on in these stages, because we were involved in this process much later on. So we saw the impact of this during the anti-corruption bill process, where the anti-corruption bill had to undergo 150 amendments from the bill to act stage. So there were 150 amendments done just during that process. So had the civil society and public been given space to give their feedback and input at an earlier stage, this much of amendments would have been avoided. So that impact we can see from the anti-corruption bill example actually. So
lawmaking in general is a problematic area in Sri Lanka. Newsfirst has raised this issue many times on our programs, and sometimes we manage to succeed a little bit, but then the lessons seem to be lost over and over. And Sankhitha, from the point of view of Verité, have you found any more issues with this bill?
Yes, so we've also made recommendations to the committee and to the ministry about this, having reviewed the framework. I'll make 3 main points. The first one is about once assets are recovered or frozen and held with the Proceeds of Crime Management Authority that Nethmi mentioned, and then at the later stage, once it's forfeited, that is after a finalization of a judicial order or recovered from another country, once it's recovered, there are these spaces where large amounts of assets will be held in certain authorities, right? So like Nethmi said, there needs to be independence of those authorities, but you also need further accountability measures to be conformed with, so that you don't run the risk of re-stealing of the assets. So the pot of money that we get access to after this entire process should not be re-corrupted or re-stolen, because we are dealing with a corrupt state system. So we are calling for better accountability mechanisms, public reporting, transparency, record keeping, asset management systems that are streamlined and systematized in a way that would make the stolen assets and recovered assets less amenable to re-stealing. The second one is about certain powers that are given to the investigation officers and these authorities that we talked about. One I can talk about is called the notice calling for explanation. So this is where, if the investigating officer, with the sanction of the designated officer, finds that they need to ask someone to explain their assets, they have the authority under this proposed framework to call for an explanation within 3 days. Now, we are working in a context where even good laws like the ICCPR Act, the purported online, what is supposed to be a good law, Online Safety Act, are at risk of abuse and are actually being abused. So it is in that context that we are also trying to give a whole swathe of really strong powers to law enforcement authorities. So and we have failed to find precedent to this kind of power elsewhere. So in the UK, you have something called an unexplained wealth order, which can be given by a court, not by a mere investigating officer or a police officer, but by a court after judicial sanction, to certain categories once certain criteria have been met, like the value of the asset is over £50,000, or the person in question is a politically exposed person or a public official. So that way you add certain safeguards to the process without giving the authorities the power to just call upon anyone on the street, a private citizen who has acquired a land, to explain their assets within 3 days. Perhaps they have a flight to go to, perhaps they have a personal function. Of course, it allows for extension, but we say the right to property is also quite important, and given the context that we're operating in, that this should be subjected to judicial sanction. But also we need to consult, in terms of this law, we need to consult with a further group of people, the human rights activists in this country, the people who have the experience of having been subjected to the abuse of authority by the powers that be. It is really important that we go through that further consultation point. And the third one is about at the point of repairing or providing compensation or damages to victims of crime that is provided for in this framework. It allows somebody who's a victim of a crime to go to the district court, and upon proving on a balance of probability that a crime has occurred, to claim compensation or damages, which is laudable. And it allows the person to appoint their agent, to nominate someone to do it on their behalf. But we are calling for the ability for there to be public interest litigation as well at that stage, because often the kind of corruption and crime that happens, the impact is quite diffused, and it is often the general entire population that is a victim. So there's no identifiable victim that has that direct claim and can show that they have been personally impacted by that. So we have proposed that there be public interest legal standing in legal proceedings, both at the district court level and in the criminal proceedings. So these are the three main recommendations that we've made.
Now, this particular bill, once it becomes law, it's not just to do with financial crimes. It has to do with, as you said,
proceeds of any crime.
So bribery, drug trafficking, which is a major menace in Sri Lanka, terrorist financing, which of course was a huge problem. We had a 30-year war, and terrorist financing certainly comes into it, and in today's day and age that's a major concern internationally, worldwide, I would say. So it's a far-reaching law which is expected. Sankhitha, could you give us a little bit of a synopsis of the United Nations STAR program? So there is this global program which we in Sri Lanka, our governments have had dealings with in the past, but for some reason over the last few years that relationship doesn't seem to have flourished much. Could you give us a little bit of a synopsis on this?
Yeah. So STAR became a household word, I think, during the Aragalaya, because there was this idea that perhaps STAR could recover Sri Lanka's assets for Sri Lanka if we gave them 1 million signatures, citizens signing 1 million citizens signing. But this is in fact not true. The Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative is an initiative between a combination of the World Bank and the UNODC, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and they are a technical institute. What they do as an initiative is provide technical and expertise to states that are engaging in an asset recovery process. So for this to happen, you need political will. There needs to be an invitation extended to the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative by some part of the executive of government. So civil society cannot call upon STAR to recover assets. The executive needs to do this. So going back to how things were a few years ago, there were points at which the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative was providing legal expertise for the original draft of Proceeds of Crime Act that was created in 2018, and in fact civil society and some of us were part of that. So there was an original framework, and at that point STAR was giving technical assistance. In the same way, for certain cases that were being investigated at that time as well, STAR was providing technical assistance. So often when you talk about asset recovery, you have an origin state, the place that assets were stolen from, and a destination state. So that coordination is not easy. You often, from an origin state, you don't have knowledge of the destination country legal process. You don't have a knowledge of how asset recovery in other states have happened. So that's the gap that STAR fills by connecting you with the relevant persons, relevant personnel, relevant legal systems and expertise. So it is still very much open to an executive, as I talked about, the political will and enforcement of laws. Once this law is passed, if we want to wait for the law to pass, we can still wait for that perhaps. But after that, there will be no excuse for us not to reach out on specific cases. We need to get to the cases without talking only about frameworks and laws.
We are almost out of time, so I'm going to pose my final question to Sankhitha. How does this go forward from now?
So, irrespective of presidential elections, as Nethmi talked about, we need to pass this law. We need to pass this law, and one further point that we have made is that this law, when it comes, needs to have a specific provision showing within what time period all provisions will be operationalized. If not, it will become one more law that is observed in the breach. And then we need to show the citizens, the government, whatever government comes into play, needs to demonstrate to the citizens that it's actually serious about action and not just talking the talk. Because if you look at what the IMF's program has also prescribed, or Sri Lanka has agreed upon with the IMF, it's about passing an entire spate of laws. And of course, on the fiscal side, there are certain targets to be met, but on the corruption side, we are only talking about disclosures and the passing of laws. We are not talking about accountability. So as you know, civil society also did a diagnostic report, governance diagnostic report, and there we have called GISL, Verité Research, PAFRL, CPA, National Peace Council, Sarvo, there are 6 organizations. We have called for there to be reporting on how these shiny new powers are being used.
Sankhitha Gunaratne, Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verité Research, and Nethmi Jinadasa, Advocacy and Research Officer at TISL. Thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your views. And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, the news is coming up next. Have a good evening.